Welcome, everyone. I am Tracy Johnson, Executive Director of Colorado Springs World Affairs Council. This evening, we are fortunate to be hearing from a most illustrious tour guide on the roots and impacts of Russia's war on Ukraine. I know we're all fascinated by this, and we are fortunate to be hearing from Dr. Julie Newton this evening. She is currently a visiting professor at Colorado College. She holds degrees from Princeton University, Columbia University, and Oxford, where she heads the University Consortium, funded by the Carnegie Corporation of New York, which brings together 6 universities in the US, the EU, and Russia to promote engagement between Russia and Western countries. Some of that activity has obviously been put on a halt. Nonetheless, tonight, we're going to be learning much more than perhaps you've heard from a very interesting and knowledgeable lady who has spent a significant amount of time in all the countries impacted. I want to give a special thanks also this evening to John Gould, who is not just a professor at Colorado College, but a wonderful and valued member of Colorado Springs World Affairs Council. He served as an important link between us here in the CSWAC office and Dr. Newton. So thank you, John. Couldn't do it without you. Now I'm going to turn this over to Julie, and everyone, please be thinking about as she listens and spells the tale of the roots and causes and impacts, and be prepared with questions, which we will have later in the evening. Enjoy.
Hey, Julie, I'm so sorry. There you go.
Yeah, thank you, Tracy. I appreciate that. Very nice, warm welcome. And thank you, John, too. I want to thank John Gould for bringing me into this. I think is an absolutely wonderful occasion. I'm very passionate about this whole topic, and I find the topic, I'm passionate about dialogue. I'm passionate about engagement with adversaries and enemies, trying to overcome divisions. But now with this war, it is so difficult to even contemplate the concept of dialogue or engagement. So we're left trying to think about what the causes are of this and trying to understand causality, because I do believe that understanding the causes correctly and adequately, I think, helps us to better figure out how to respond to this extraordinary challenge. And I think one of the greatest challenges that we face since World War II. And I want to start by saying I have we're going to go over some of the typical narratives that are out there in the mainstream. We could go over even the narratives in Russia as well, but I'm going to focus mostly on American narratives, which will also be British narratives, which is where I live. But in doing so, I just wanted to add that these narratives are not, I want to start this is Putin's war, and in some ways trying to understand the complexity of this cause in no way either sympathizes with anything that Putin has done, or that it's absolutely unprovoked, unjustified. It's a horrendous situation. There is no way of saying that it's okay or right. However, it is necessary, I think, to look at this from the way the Russians have looked at it for the last 30 years, because this is a culmination of a lot of events that have been building up for 30 years. So I just want to say from the outset, before I begin to share my screen, that this is very much an attempt at an analytical analysis that is not in any way meant to have a sympathetic. It's hard enough to empathize with the situation. In other words, put yourself in their shoes, but it's certainly not in any way to sympathize, particularly under the present circumstances. But if I may, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, because I find with Zoom, it's a little easier to do this when we are all, when we are all in. Let me make sure that I've got the right screen up here. Here we go. When we've got PowerPoint. So if I may do that here, here we are. So Welcome, everybody. This is going to be, I'm going to start off with the impact of the war first, and then look at the roots, and then try to think about where to go from here. What does it mean? You know, what are the dilemmas that we face in the West? And I'm sure that most everybody knows where we are, you know, just reading the newspaper, but I just thought that it might be a good idea just to go over generally what Putin's political goals were when he started this war on February 24th. We could call it Plan A. You know, what were exactly Putin's goals? And the first was basically Ukrainian neutrality, which was very much, he called it demilitarization of Ukraine, but Ukrainian neutrality, however one wants to, whatever degree to which it would be neutral. The second would be regime change. He was after that. He called it denazification, which actually was code for regime change. And that was because he felt that, look, you know, Zelensky only has about a 34% approval rating back in December. So go ahead and just go the regime change. The Ukrainians will welcome the Russians with flowers was the idea, because Zelensky was really looked upon as not being a great leader at that time, which is hard to believe now. The third was to stop any possibility of EU membership. The first one, of course, Ukrainian neutrality, would have stopped NATO membership, but also the goal was to stop EU membership, moving closer to the EU, which had started around 2013, 2014. And because EU membership signifies strategic alignment with the West. And we're going to get into why that's such a threat for Putin. This all failed. The military goals there were going to be divide Ukraine into two via a pincer movement from the north, from the east, and then also from up above, from down below, from the south. So, and it was going to be short, get in, get out. It was going to be a raid. They even called it a raid for this special military operation. As you know, it's not called a war in Russia. It's called a special military operation. So it was going to be a raid to move in for regime change. And the Georgian War, which the Georgian-Russo War back in 2008, was the model that was very much on the minds of Putin, who was very isolated at the time, as I'm sure you all have read. He was stuck for 2 years in his little gigantic table in various places where he was down south and also in Kremlin, but saw absolutely no one and was increasingly surrounded just by a bunch of yes men. And so this was very much skewed and completely out of touch, planned for military goals, and it failed. So then, oops, it's not going to work here. I'm not sure why. Oh, here we go. Sorry. So that failed. But this is the general look of how it looks to Ukraine. Where I have this map here because this was I think a very nice original map. The troops were coming in from the north, the south. You can see them coming up from Crimea, up to Kherson, up to Odessa. And of course, from the east, you see the Donbass there, Donetsk and Luhansk. And then you have also the Russian invasion of Ukraine that was right from the very beginning. I just think these little maps are very nice to show how they were coming in from the north, from the east, and from the south. And then, of course, that all failed. So now then today, they've gone back to a much more, moderated plan of Plan B, as they call it. And it's targeting the east, as I'm sure we all see from the news, but it's, as they call it, the complete liberation in very oxymoronic terms, a complete liberation of Donbass, which of course means Ukraine's entire, if we go backwards to this, it means the entire red and pink section of the Donbass. They want to liberate, as they say, all of that. The bright red, or the bright sort of brick colored, those are, of course, the little statelets that the Russians been fighting in for the past 8 years. That's the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic. But the broader regions, the oblasts, are now what he's after in order to take a sort of win back home. And he also wants this land bridge, which you'll see in a second, in a map that I've got next. But he wants a Donbass and he wants into the south, into a land bridge down to Crimea. But it's progressing quite slowly in the south. At first, they made rapid gains, but interestingly, the Ukrainian resistance continues to hold out, refusing to surrender. And some say, at least the Pentagon say, the fall of Mariupol, which is down in the south, that's part of that land bridge, the fall is not inevitable. But others, of course, in the EU say it'll fall within days. I have a lot of military specialists whom I follow who say that the Russian military is so much weaker than anybody actually really understands, that the Ukrainian forces stand a lot better chance than we think. I don't know really where the side is. The Pentagon is the one that's following the same people that I'm reading, who says that the fall is not inevitable of Mariupol, but it's hard to imagine the Ukrainians can hold out. But nevertheless, I'm very interested in this debate, and we'll see what happens. In any case, we do know that this is a prelude to a much larger offensive operation. So again, here is the orange or the gold section are the statelets, and the bigger section there are the what's called regions. In Russian, it's called oblasts. And here is a little map of, I've just drawn it to see the land bridge. You could see Mariupol there, Kherson a little bit farther to the west, down to Crimea, which is in the stripe section, to show that that is disputed territory. But it's certainly very Russian controlled, and the troops are coming up from there. Odessa has struggled. They've struggled to even think about taking Odessa. Of course, that ship, the Moskva that sank, was meant to launch attacks on Odessa from there. So we'll see where they move from there. Here's another. This is from yesterday, a map. This shows what the Russians actually are controlling, but there are new weapons coming in from the United States and also from Europe. There are a lot more that President Biden has just signed in to come in. And a lot of people feel that so long as these weapons come in, the Ukrainians will hold out. They certainly have the will to do so. And the Russian military, they're 75%. 75% of Russian troops are actually in Ukraine right now. That's a huge number. And getting more troops there is not going to be easy for many months, because there's not the training. There's also so many problems in the Russian military, from top down, from corruption all the way down, that this is part of the reason why many people feel that the Russians are not going to hold out. This is not Syria. They didn't face the same kind of powerful army with the same kinds of weaponry that they're now facing in Ukraine. So it's a much bigger challenge for the Russians. The Ukrainians this is part of where the Ukrainians have recaptured. You can see Kiev. They've retaken most of all that area. So we'll see whether Ukrainians can hold out. I think that's an important caveat. Nobody knows exactly, but I think it's important to stress that this is not a done deal. In any case, it certainly leads to probably a grinding continuation of this war for a long time to come, unless it's stopped with a big insurgency that's going to go on for a very long time as well. In any case, I want to point out that this war is changing the world. It's changing the face of Europe. It's changing the world in many ways. And I just want to go over very quickly the ways in which it is changing the world, because, at CC, there's a slight, just such focus on the war itself and many people say they just hadn't really thought about the implications across the world. And I'm sure most of you're in the World Affairs Council, so I'm sure you think about the international implications, but perhaps going over this will also elicit some questions for our question and answer period. I do think there is a serious possibility for escalation for war between the United States and NATO and Russia. I think that escalation is probably greater than at any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis, if not before. As far as the casualties go, we're up to, I just checked these numbers today, we have about almost 5,000 civilian casualties that are reported on the Ukrainian side. The Russian estimates, the Pentagon estimates around 15,000. Some people say it's more like 7. I think those are more European. Of course, the Russians have numbers that are significantly lower, but nevertheless, and they have crematoriums on the border to try to get rid of the evidence. There have mass morgues to get rid of the evidence, but in any case, the numbers are mounting, and that's going to have very important, I think, implications for Russian domestic politics later on. There's pressure on the Western economies, on Western polities, as these countries are struggling to overcome the effects of the pandemic. We have refugees, which we're going to see in a second, sanctions that are hurting ourselves, with oil and gas driving the prices up, food supplies diminishing. So economic effects of food supplies is something I really want to focus on a lot here, because I think there's a real point about this, which is so beyond our own borders. Ukraine, as I'm sure you all know, is the 5th largest wheat producer in the world. Russia is the first largest wheat producer, which is a huge shift, given in Soviet days, they used to import wheat from us, but now they have become the first wheat producer in the world. China imports about 30% of its barley and a lot of its corn, and also about 28% of its sunflower oil from Ukraine, a lot of iron ore from Ukraine, fertilizer, a lot of stuff is imported to China from Ukraine. The Russians, of course, have said they used to close down wheat. Recently, they closed down wheat exports to every place, but now they're going to let the Chinese have as much as they want to try to sweeten the Chinese sentiments towards Russia, and to make sure that the Chinese help Russia through this. So whether that happens is it's not so clear. But anyway, this is the point that I'm really interested in, is that cheap bread has always been very important for a lot of developing countries, particularly like Egypt. And it's when they raised their bread prices, that was the cause of the 2011 sort of Tahrir Square revolts in Cairo. And so you really do have this question of destabilization in a lot of these developing countries. And Egypt, I think, is a very good example of the possibilities of what could happen here. Then we have refugees. That number is up to 5 million refugees today. 7.1 million are displaced. And here is a good map of the refugees. Here's a good map of the refugees going. All those little black circles with X's are exit spots for Ukrainians to try and leave. And the arrows show which direction the Ukrainians are leaving in, as you see huge amounts from Poland, which of course we all know. So in just 8 weeks of this war, it's the 6th largest refugee outflow in 60 years. So that's obviously going to have an impact on all of our economies. And you already see it now in countries like France, which I've been following the debates of the elections that are coming up, and that is coming up in about a week's time. And it's really quite worrying. They're very worried about the possibility of more immigrants, and Le Pen is making a very big deal of this, and the possibility of, even though these immigrants will be white with blue eyes, it's still more pressure. And she's saying that this is a war that Macron helped to, because of his weakness, he helped to bring on. You then have, after the refugee crisis, after the economic and food pressures, then we're back to the Cold War in terms of remilitarization of Europe, the new military divide in Europe, which is resulting from this war. So you have a new buildup. You now have Finland and Sweden who are about to join NATO any day now. This is extraordinary that Finland is about to join NATO after years of Finland being neutral and the whole concept of Finlandization. Now it's about to join NATO. What a big switch from Finland public opinion, even from December. Germany, also a historic change, ramping up of military spending. 86% of Germans approved of sending weapons to Ukraine. This is an extraordinary shift in German public opinion. Cyber economic warfare tools ramping up. This is going to, what's worrying about this is, I think, with more cyber, and I have a young woman in my class whose father works in the Defense Department, working on cyber attacks. And he said he's never been busier in his entire life. They've had thousands and thousands of attempts trying to get through US Defense Department, State Department, barriers, cyber barriers. And he said it's really a matter of time before they get through, whether it'll be a break on critical infrastructure or what. But all of this is going to fuel not only anger, but a chance for mistake and miscalculation. And you may have seen the Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, recently say that it's maybe time now to include a critical attack on cyber infrastructure as worthy of an Article 5 response, which would be an attack on one as an attack on all. How you would define that, he didn't say, but that's the first time that that's come up, and that was just this week. So then you have nuclear weapons, the chances of increased use via what's called IE, inadvertent escalation, or deliberate escalation. And we're going to get to the possibility of deliberate escalation on the part of Putin in a second, because I think that there is a chance of that. Because Putin sees this in terms of an existential threat. And we're also going to look at what that means for him. And in Russian nuclear doctrine, an existential threat allows you to use nuclear weapons first. Whenever a country, Russia, sees it's an existential threat either to the regime or to the country itself, it permits first use of nuclear weapons. All of this is going to replace our critical domestic needs, whether it's education, whether it's trying to overcome polarization, whether it's social welfare net, whether it's addressing infrastructure. All of these things are going to be demoted now in favor of more defensive needs. Then just to the military stuff, I just think maps, I love maps. So forgive me, I've got a few maps here. In the heart of Europe now, it's threatened to become stuffed with even more weapons than we had since 2014. Already since 2014, you'll see, I'll give you a little sliver of what's been going on since then. But this is going to increase the chance of perception, misperception, miscalculation. And that is one of the most worrying things about all this. This is a funny little part in Northern Europe where you have Kaliningrad, which is actually Russia, and it's stuck between NATO countries, which of course are Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia there. And they're connected by that little yellow gap called the Suwalki Gap, which is actually a little tiny road and a railroad. And it's used by the Russians to transfer really important goods and military equipment from Belarus to Kaliningrad and back and forth. So you can see that the Russians really make it very difficult for NATO to defend these NATO countries. It's called anti-access area denial. So the Russians have made it quite difficult for us to get access to that, especially with one of their best air defense missiles. It's called S-400s. The Russians have sold those to the Indians. They've sold them to the Turks. They've sold them to the Chinese, and they have their own. They're some of the best air defense missiles available, and the Russians happen to be the ones who have produced them. So this, you can see that they can shoot down any of our weapons that come in to try to defend our NATO countries. So it makes it very difficult, and that therefore increases these Northern European, what we call East Central European fears. It makes them feel more vulnerable, the fact that they feel indefensible. Then you have a lot of caliber nuclear capable ship-based cruise missiles. I'm not going to get into this very much. I just want to give you an example of how many weapons are already here, and they're now being increased. This has happened since 2014, and there's been a tit for tat. They put in weapons, we put in weapons. So this area really is becoming reminiscent of Cold War stuff. The Black Sea is very similar, where you have, you have the Sea of Azov, which is, of course, that's Ukraine to the north on the left, the map on the left-hand side. The Russians are controlling that area now. That's that's where Mariupol is, and they want total control of that. They've built a bridge over this area called the Strait of Kerch that goes basically from Russia over to Crimea. And so they want control, strategic control over the Sea of Azov. But interestingly and importantly, that's one of the exit routes for grain, for sunflower oil, for all of the goods that all the fertilizer and the agricultural products that are produced out of Ukraine, and also out of Odessa, which is on the map on the right. That is, it's just above it's just to the left of the little circle there, where that's Crimea is circled. So there's a battle for those, and you've got all kinds of ships. The one that was that sank, that are now really in the near misses and that kind of thing going on, which is quite scary. This is changing international relations in very deeply negative ways. And I think that's important to point out. How is this changing international relations? Well, it's consolidating two Cold Wars. The first one is the United States and its allies on the one hand versus Russia on the other. I think it's safe to say that this Cold War is already consolidated. We can talk about what a definition of a Cold War is. It is a term with 5 different features. I won't get into that, but suffice it to say, I think we're back to a form of Cold War. It's not the same Cold War. And keep in mind, Cold War, I use the term as a diagnosis, not a prescription for policy, but it's a diagnosis of reality. And the United States and its allies versus China, well, it's not perhaps quite a Cold War yet, but it's intensified much, and it's moving possibly towards a Cold War. So it could be 2 Cold Wars. In the words of Robert Legvold, who's a big professor at Columbia, he believes we already are in 2 Cold Wars. I'm not so sure we're quite there yet with China, but that's a question of debate. But the point is, the results is we have a more rigidly bipolar international system, which is divided between the United States and its allies, including Japan, South Korea, Australia on one side, and China and its allies, which is basically Russia and a few of the rest on the other. And the world is being divided into 2. And that is new. That is something that from Stephen Waltz to John Mearsheimer, all the realists in the world who really do believe that we're moving towards a much more rigid bipolarity, which we haven't been in since 1989 or certainly 1991. Now, this is, I do think the reason why I'm a little bit hesitant about the Chinese, whether we're moving really towards Cold War, is because it's not clear to me anyway how willing China is to go with the side of Russia. They're entente, and it's not an alliance. It is a deep entente. The Chinese are waffling quite a bit, but their ambivalence nevertheless is so great that it is deepening the bipolarity of the international system. And they are beginning to move. I think they're missing an opportunity to possibly play peacemaker here and really moving on the side of Russia. So this bipolar makes cooperation in the global commons much harder to achieve and to sustain, much, much harder. For example, it's going to make climate change much harder, because climate change, to solve this problem, it takes sacrifices by all the major powers, the great powers. But when you have a bipolar division of the world, these great powers are much less willing to sacrifice anything, because they're worried about how any sacrifice might affect the balance of power. They're not going to be willing to make these kinds of sacrifices for themselves, because again, it might give too much power to the other side. And then the countries that are caught in between that have to make sacrifices, well, they're going to be concerned with either bandwagoning with their mentor or balancing their mentor. And so therefore, in these kinds of Cold War bipolar conditions, you tend to ignore the problems in the global commons, such as, again, climate change or global health, or you just can't find compromise in the same way. These bipolar consolidation trends, I think, were very much on demonstrated in the UN Human Rights Council the other day. That was on April 7th. And that led to a very interesting vote, which was a bit unanticipated at the beginning of this war. Suddenly now we have 93 votes were with the rest, but 82 were with the rest. And that's this bipolar sort of bifurcation that I'm talking about. Those 82 were not all voted against the United States, because the United States put the motion out there of expelling Russia from the UN Human Rights Council. Some of those were abstentions, some of those were votes against, but together it was quite a surprise for the West, especially given the fact that as early as February 24th, 141 voted against Russia. A bunch of them abstained, but China at that time abstained, and now it is voted against what the United States wish. So they've moved more towards Russia. The BRICS and the rest are now undermining efforts to isolate Russia, India, Saudi Arabia, various others. So therefore, China is less isolated today than it was in early March, which is absolutely fascinating trend, and one that I think is explainable for a number of reasons. We can come back to it. But anyway, it's also helped to stabilize the ruble because of India and China. They're buying Russian oil, and that is one of the biggest moneymakers for the Russian coffers. So they've been able to offset the fact that half of their foreign central bank reserves have been frozen. So they've been able to make money on the side and stabilize the ruble. But now we have a sense in this bifurcated world, is this going to be an existential conflict between authoritarianism on one side and democracy on the other? Well, I don't think it's going to become like that. I think it's going to be much more of a great power contest in a bipolar world, but it does begin to feel much more existential in this way of authoritarianism and democracy. And there are many people who are beginning to frame it that way. And I find that quite worrying, because it's going to make this much more of a emotional and existential, much harder to find compromise with this, and to focus on interests rather than norms and values. This is just to show you the kinds of high earnings that Russia's been able to make to get around sanctions. And part of the reason is because suddenly you have a lot of countries that are beginning to sort of rally around it. And so also it's changing the world, and that is deglobalizing the world. This is probably the nail, as Stephen Walt says, the nail in the coffin in the whole trend of hyper-globalization, which started after the end of the Cold War. We're fragmenting now. These formerly unified systems are becoming more atomized into regions and to specific sectors. So for example, the payment systems, they're fragmenting away from SWIFT to the Chinese system, which was called CIPS, and then the Russian system, which is really not worth mentioning, but it's just a Eurasian infrastructure system. But perhaps the Russians and Chinese they're working on combining theirs. But in any case, we are fragmenting away from SWIFT and pushing that trend. Tech flows are also fragmenting. Chips, software, telecom equipment, all national security concerns. Countries are beginning to renationalize this rather than having supply chains that are international. Just Intel, for example, is now becoming a national security priority for the United States to go back and rebuild Intel so that we're not so dependent on the Taiwanese. Energy flows are disrupted to the West, as we know, probably going to get worse. In other words, anything strategic, that means anything that's susceptible to sanctions, are now subject to fragmentation and deglobalization. What does this mean? It means global growth is going to slow, and this is going to deepen Cold War trends as well. So welcome to this new, rigidly more bipolar world. The consequences are, we already see the strategic stability talks have been put on pause. They actually have been suspended. I don't know when we're going to get back to them. This means that New START, which was signed in the Obama era in 2010, that now could lapse. I hope not, but it's hard to imagine how we're going to get back to that. Those talks were going great guns. Sorry for the very poor pun here, but now they've just been stopped. Arms control in other dimensions like cyber, all the new weaponry, the more hypersonic weaponry, those have all been rejected or put on hold. And that's very concerning because these new weapons, the lines between conventional weapons and non-conventional cyber and the lines between conventional and nuclear are now blurred. These look like weapons of mass destruction, and we're not talking about there are no rules at the moment. So it's just a free-for-all for producing them. And we have a multipolar nuclear world now. So it's much more complicated than during the Cold War. Escalation to great power. I feel like I'm going to make you all very depressed. You might want to, it's cocktail hour. So maybe everybody needs to get a drink if we finish this talk. But anyway, escalation to great power war, misunderstanding, mistake. The threats of this are all too real. And again, making addressing the problems in the global commons much harder to contemplate here. And I didn't mention the political stability. I think as the food prices go up, what do we, that's something that we don't really want to even talk about, even contemplate. But competition with China now is going to be much harder to manage in this situation. Again, weaponization of cyber and financial instruments. It's their weapons of mass destruction, as David Hendrickson calls them, I think appropriately. David Hendrickson is a professor at Colorado College who has great, I think, authority in this field across the United States. And it's been something that I think is a new weaponization of these instruments is a whole new field that is really being discussed and plumbed at places like Georgetown University and also in the Pentagon. We have abandoned dialogue. I've actually asked someone who's very close to William Burns and who's head of the CIA, is there stuff going on behind the scenes with between the United States and Russia? And they did say very little that is official. There may be some stuff, there's certainly military to military stuff going on for deconfliction, but there's very little political will to reduce Russia-US tensions right now because of the fact of what Russia is doing. Our televisions are now showing the absolutely atrocious things that the Russians are doing. So it's really even difficult to contemplate dialogue in these circumstances. Who could blame the West for wanting to have dialogue with the Kremlin at this point? But I do think it's going to be harder to manage than the original Cold War because we have more players, because we have advanced weaponry, weakening the chances that nuclear deterrence will hold. And I think the information war is much harder. There are deep fakes now out there that are much more difficult to prove. Internet control unlike what Bill Clinton said, it's not like throwing Jell-O to the wall. No, it is easier to control than they thought, although not completely. We can talk about how the Russian intelligentsia is trying to get around it. The print media, even in the Cold War, the New York Times did not leave Russia. They stayed in Moscow and in Russia. The New York Times has withdrawn their staff from Russia. Bloomberg no longer has bylines that are printed, and the Washington Post is in the process of leaving Russia as well. You have a lot of Russian intellectuals, a lot of my friends that work with me in the university consortium, a lot of the liberal opposition, they're either in exile or in prison. We're having a big conference in Athens, and we invited one person who's been with us a long time, and he said, Julie, I'm really sorry I can't attend. I'm actually in prison. So he's under house arrest. So, it's really makes it very difficult for those intellectuals then to compete with the Kremlin narrative. What caused this war? I mean, there are a lot of people who feel that it's inevitable. I'm going to have to move fast through this, but I would like to contemplate this for the second half the last part of this talk. I would like to contemplate some of the narratives and to put forward my own narrative on this, because I think in understanding better what the causes are, I think we can begin to address the problem, because as I've just spent so much time pointing out, the stakes are so high that I think we really do need to address this problem. And in understanding the causes, we can address it more effectively, and I think with a greater chance of long-term peace. But the first narrative is by, and I say liberals not in an American sense. This is defined in terms of international relations theory. Ann Applebaum, Mike McFall, the mainstream media, they define it in terms of, it says that the nature of the regime informs the way that regime behaves. In other words, its authoritarian nature, or its kleptocratic nature, its imperialist nature, is the end of the story. That is why Putin behaves in the way that he does. It is Putin. If you remove the leader, or if you and change the regime, it might act differently. Or perhaps if you have if you just focus on the fact that Russia is inherently imperialistic, it's going to act the way it does. And anyway, we call these kind of essentialist narratives. They are narratives that focus on Russia's essence, its essential character. The second set of narratives says, no, it's all about security. That this is not about the essence of Russia. It's not about the internal nature. It's about the external forces on Russia's borders. Russia has felt threatened, NATO enlargement, EU enlargement, it's just unrelenting. And so it's therefore all the West's fault. Right? So you have the first narratives, it's all Russia's fault because of their internal nature. The second narrative, it's all the West's fault because they've put external security pressures on Russia's border. There's another set of narratives. This is a very good friend of mine. I have huge respect for him. He's at Princeton. Historical determinism, though he said you may have read it, he said in a recent interview in the New Yorker, where he said, look, this is really Russia, will be Russia. It's historically determined. They can't change. It's basically imperialism. I respectfully disagree with this. I'm not so pessimistic that I think that people can't change. I think that countries can change. Look at Nazi Germany, how once you bring Germany into Western institutions, it has fundamental change of its nature, of its policies, and they are truly fundamental. And I don't think there was anything inevitable about the Crimean War. Or the Crimean annexation. I also don't think there's anything inevitable about this war. The answers are far more contingent and dependent on events that is often understood or often accepted. And the answer really is an action-reaction downward spiral. There were security dilemmas that built up on all sides for Russia, for East Central Europe, that's the Baltics, Poland, and security dilemmas for the United States and for the EU. And all of these action, reaction, one side acts, the other side reacts, all of these security dilemmas accumulated and led to an increase of mutual distrust and a downward trajectory of Russia-West relations, even though there were these intermittent attempts at resets, like the Obama reset. Then there was one that the early Bush years had one. So you have it as a double threat dilemma for Russia. And the thing is that Russia has always felt like there are external threats because the West has always been superior ever since the Renaissance. There have been persistent invasions of Russia, and the Poles have invaded, the Swedes have invaded twice, the Germans have invaded twice, the French have invaded. Everyone seems to have invaded Russians, except and Russia still managed to dispel and overcome those invasions and not be colonized. Of course, if you ask the Balts, they will say, well, the Russians instigated a lot of those invasions themselves. But from Russia's perspective, they have always felt that they've been threatened from the West. Today, too, they're also threatened from the East. And so they've got this double set of external threats, which is extremely important. On top of this, Russia has always, from the time of the Mongols, always felt the sense of internal threats too, that the Russia could disintegrate at a moment's notice for a variety of reasons. It's always been economically backwards. It has porous borders, a very ambiguous and ambivalent identity, and so forth. So you have this combination of external threats and internal threats that has preoccupied every Russian leader from Peter the Great to Putin. And what does this mean? It's mean that Kremlin has these threat perceptions that are real. They're not instrumental the way many people say that, oh, NATO's not going to invade. What are they so worried about? They just use this excuse of threat perceptions. No, they're real, because you have this 30 years of mounting security grievances because they feel they've been excluded from Europe's security architecture, unlike Nazi Germany was included in that after they defeated in World War II. They feel that their voice has been dismissed in these security architectures, and there's a lot of evidence to show that that's true. There's a lot of American officials who say, absolutely, we dismissed their voice because we felt like they were a declining power, and they had to do what we wanted them to do anyway, because why bother bringing them in, because they were too weak, and we felt that they needed to democratize, and they would democratize. Well, all this, of course, backfired. And they felt then over time that their own interests, particularly economic and human, in Europe were dismissed or ignored, even in their own backyard. Add to this, it's not just Russia's threats or Russia has this threat perception. You have Eastern Europe that also feels threatened. Look, the Balts have been subjugated for decades, and there's fears of Russian irredentism. On top of that, you have EU and Russia and European sense of threats. They have dashed expectations of Russian democratization and of fear that Russia may come back to be this great power adversary again. All of this increased distrust over time. So you have Russian actions that where Russia began to make these very negative decisions from Yeltsin that allowed Russia over 3 decades to slide slowly back towards authoritarianism. It wasn't inevitable. Yeltsin started all these, he made terrible mistakes, and then Yeltsin took advantage of the mistakes that Yeltsin made to compound them. Then that adds, Russian actions make the West react in a way, growing distrust. And so the West then begins to hedge its bets by expanding NATO. Then the Russians react to that, threat perceptions increase, and irredentist impulses, or those kinds of old historical instincts to say, let's create buffer zones. All of those instincts are exacerbated by the reaction. So this is what we do in our class. This is a downward spiral over 22 events, 22 turning points or decision points over 30 years. And I obviously am not going to bore you with all this. It would take 3 weeks to do it, but it goes action, reaction, and they're not, some of them are Western actions, some of them are Russian actions, but nevertheless, you have a straight downward trajectory. And that's the important point, is that it's not all Putin, and it's not all Russia's fault. It's not all the West's fault. And it's not all America's fault either. The EU is in there as well. So I don't think we have time to get into this, but you have a lot of Western actions and Russian reactions. I will skip. I just want to point out one little thing here. It's a really wonderful little talk here between Javier Solana, who was the NATO Secretary General, and Yevgeny Primakov, who was the foreign minister of Russia in 1997. And they were very good friends. And Yevgeny said to Javier, Yevgeny, we're friends here. Please understand this. Don't enlarge NATO into the former Soviet space, especially not into Ukraine or Georgia. Please understand that there is no Russian leader who will be able to tolerate these enlargements, either into the Baltics, but particularly into Georgia or Ukraine. So with that, of course, you have NATO enlargement then happens anyway, because how can you refuse the Baltics if you don't, you let Poland in, and also the right to choose your alliance, that kind of thing. There were a lot of missed opportunities. Maybe we could have enlarged NATO in a different way. Just for the record, there was a project called Partnership for Peace, which would have prolonged it to allow the Poles, the Balts, the Russians to really make peace with each other over years, much like a peace and reconciliation chamber that they could have done, rather than just enlarging enlarging NATO right up to Russia's borders, knowing what we know about Russia's threat perceptions. But we did it anyway. In Bucharest of 2008, we offered not a membership action plan. We offered them a very vague promise to say, don't worry, you won't become part of NATO now, but you'll become part of NATO at some point. That then prompted the Russian-Georgian war, because Russia decided, well, we will make sure, and I can, let's see if I can find this here. And also Europe began to enlarge at this in 2004. That also began when you have NATO enlarging, that suddenly Europe beginning to enlarge. All of it begins to look like a conspiracy, especially in Russian eyes, especially when you have the United States using force for regime change in Iraq, and also in Belgrade over Kosovo. So you have George Kennan, who said, and this quote, right, the second bullet point, I think is really quite helpful. He says, I think the Russians will gradually react quite adversely if NATO enlarges, and it will affect their policies. And then we, the NATO expanders, will say, see, I told you so. That's just the way the Russians are. But Kennan concludes, this is just wrong, because he says it'll be a reaction to Western action. And when you add all these action reactions together, because I add not just George Kennan, I also add Western reactions to Russian actions, because it's not just our fault. I think you wind up having a downward spiral. And this red section here, by focusing on character of Russia and ignoring the political action-reaction dynamics, I think we have dulled our capacity to really understand what is really driving Russian behavior over the long term. And so what Russia did to solve this problem, this is where I was headed before I just want to talk a little bit about where this war could go. Russia solved this problem in what's called a risk-shy way. They're not risk-averse. As you see now, Putin has lost it. He has totally taken unbelievable risks that no one expected him in the Russian foreign affairs community, foreign policy community to take. But before that, before February 2022, he was taking these small steps where what they would do is they would find Russian communities in these countries that they worried about, where there was the possibility of NATO enlargement, or an EU enlargement always comes. It's the strategic alignment with the EU that worries them. And they would take them and give passports to the Russians, the Russian ethnic communities there that got marooned there after the Soviet Union collapsed. And they would give them passports. And then when they got worried about it, they would bring their troops in to say, it's responsibility to protect our people. And we are protecting our ethnic Russians. And therefore they would have to keep their troops there to protect them, which means that NATO membership is impossible. You cannot have NATO. NATO will not take a member country that has conflict on its territory. So that means that Georgia, Ukraine, you make conflict in their territory, you divide their territory, and voila, no NATO enlargement. Same with Moldova. All of these, what's called unresolved conflicts in the lands in between Russia and the West. That's the way they've solved this problem until now. They're solving it with all-out war. But the fact is that everyone loses here. You have security dilemmas, all this. So is this just Russia's fear of democracy, or is it security threats? Ann Applebaum will say, oh, they're just afraid of security, whereas John Mearsheimer will say it's just security threats. I argue those are interconnected. It's like a missile and a warhead. The missile is the security problem, the security threat, and that that has a warhead which has ideas. Ideas have to have an agent. It has to have a conveyor. So the warhead, as is democracy, is propelled by the missile of the security threat. So without the security threat, he's not going to be as concerned about democracy. And the evidence is that let Armenia be a democratic experiment. Armenia is moving towards democracy, and the Russians don't care because it has its strategic alignment already secured. For Putin, what does this mean now? And just to finish up here, Putin feels that he's engaged in an existential struggle, because for him, at the very bottom of this slide, underlined here, he conflates the security of his own regime with the security of Russia, the security of his country. He sees both of these at risk. For him, Russia is the regime is Russia. That's it's not just Putin, it's an age-old Russian thing, where even Catherine the Great said, that I am Russia, and Russia cannot survive without me being a strong czar. And that was the reason why she, for example, was very hesitant to democratize. Gorbachev obviously had a very different solution to this, but for Putin, who's a very conservative type czar, for him, the security of the regime is the security of the nation, and the both are at risk. So this is going to prompt him to preempt, I think. This is an existential crisis for him because NATO is moving into Ukraine, which could have a regime change. He sees it the same way as Russia, as the United States moving into Iraq as regime change, or Belgrade. It's Belgrade today, Moscow tomorrow, Baghdad today, Moscow tomorrow. So he really does have this mindset. Thomas Schelling said, in an emergency, the urge to preempt the other side, to preempt the other's preemption, could become a dominant motive. And I am very concerned that now, as Robert Jervis, who is a great international relations scholar, says, that with the infliction of a bit more pressure, if we put a bit more pressure on them, or if the Russians think, well, we'll put more pressure on Ukraine or on, because scorched earth for the Russians now, then the other side will capitulate. Either side will capitulate. And this is going to lead to a cycle of destruction, I think, and counter-destruction, because Putin is not going to back down. He is utterly dysregulated, I think, and there's a lot of, I don't want to psychoanalyze Putin. That's, I couldn't even if I wanted to, but I think there's a really interesting theory that goes to polyvagal theory of psychology, which says that his nervous system is in such fight or flight mode that he's even dysregulated. Even if you take that away, he's even if he thinks rationally, he's still in this cycle of thinking that you're going to inflict more pain and the other side will just capitulate. And the Ukrainians are not going to capitulate. I don't think there's any possibility that they're going to lay down their arms, especially if we keep wanting to give them arms, which I think we should do. But nevertheless, Putin is not going to back down at all, especially. We have to look at it through Putin's eyes. We have to understand that he sees this as an existential threat because of the 30 years previous. We have to understand that security is a major issue for him. Whether we find it repugnant to see it through his eyes or not, we must in order to find a solution. So what do? We are going to have to continue arming Ukraine for the sake of Ukrainian sovereignty, for the sake of the principle of it. We cannot afford to let Ukraine lose. But at the same time, we also, I think, for the sake of Ukraine and for the sake of to keep from escalation happening, we have to look for opportunities for negotiations. And just to conclude with this one phrase by Samuel Sharap, who's a very good, and Michael Kimmage, who are very good analysts. Sam is at Rand and Michael Kimmage is at Catholic University. And so he said, maybe we need an unjust peace, that we might have to make compromises that we don't quite want to make on behalf of Ukraine, that's required, even though this is a just war that is being fought for the sake of of Ukraine. It is a just war, but maybe for the sake of saving Ukraine and for the sake of saving Europe and for the sake of saving the world, to go back to those original threats that I pointed out in the very beginning, maybe we are going to need to think about opportunities for negotiation and for conflict resolution. And with that, I'll stop. I'm sorry for going over time, but there's a lot to talk about, so I hope you'll forgive me.
No apologies necessary. Thank you so much for that well-informed presentation. Thank you for painting that picture for us about the roots and impacts of this war. Anyone who is interested in asking Dr. Newton any questions, if you'd like to speak those questions out, I would invite you to use the raised hand function. If you are not comfortable with that, please just include your questions in the chat and I will be presenting those.
I didn't go over all the action reaction points, the 22 points. And so I'm sorry if that's not all together while you're getting your questions together. I'm sorry if it may be difficult to understand how all that fits together. And that doesn't all fit together. There's a lot of evidence to support, though, that there are lots of actions that lead to counter reactions along the way. And if anybody wants to challenge any of that, I'm happy to take on some of that.
Well, it looks like John and Sharon have a question. You guys can go first.
I just wanted to point out that there were two questions in the chat, and I could read them. The first one's from Tom Saponis. He says, how should the U.S. respond to, oops, it just moved. Yeah, how should the U.S. respond to the Russian use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine, in the hypothetical case that actually happens?
I have a good friend who's in the military who is convinced that it won't happen, that deterrence will hold because the Russians are so afraid that we would counterattack in such a way that would be absolutely just devastating for them. So therefore, he says that we really have to flex our own nuclear weapons, our own nuclear muscle, and to make it very clear that we will counterattack, and that therefore don't even consider, not even a battlefield nuclear weapon, because that seems to be the kind of weapon that Russia that they're talking about might be used. So that I think we need to make it very, very clear that going over that threshold would result in some kind of a counterattack. And that is, I think, the only answer that I can give, because I don't even want to contemplate what we would do if one were actually used. It's more what is being done. And I think there's that kind of conversation being talked about now in the military to military, of making it very, very clear what certain actions would bring on if from the West, from the United States, if Russia does use it. And I don't know where that threshold is, but it's clear that they're trying to define it.
Great. And Julie, there's a lot of really great questions in the chat. Are you able to call us up, or would you like us to read them to you?
No, I would prefer someone read it to me, because I'm not sure which ones you want to choose.
And I was going to kind of go from chat to in person. So Rusty, if you would not mind asking your question next, and then we'll return back to the chat to kind of get some variety.
You're muted, Rusty. There you go.
Thank you. Julie, what's your prognosis of the various pressures currently, and which may have emerged from the West on Russia, on Putin, on the Russian people, on the oligarch? What could be the eventual results of creating backing down or change in Russia?
Yeah. Do you mean either regime change in Russia or the current regime backing down?
Well, I'm not predicting effects, but that's the question, the effects on Russia in any significant way. Just if those are sustained, is that just an ongoing stalemate, or
Yeah.
are there areas that might break through?
I think in the short term, and I'll divide the answer into short term and medium term. In the short term, the pressures on I think Russia are much less than we would have hoped. I do think that the population continues to support Russia. His poll data has gone up. We know that recently there have been some outside pollsters for Levada who still managed to get in and try and measure that. Of course, it's difficult to know for sure because people are very frightened to say what they really think. As I'm sure you know, Rusty, you can get up to 15 years in prison for even using the word war. But and there are protesters who are hauled off to prison arrested and hauled off every day. But nevertheless, people have begun to fall in line as a result of that. But more importantly, from the sources that I have, there's a sense that they are beginning to feel that the West, this is a war between them and the West. The propaganda is having an effect on them, and they see that the economy is being hit really hard. The World Bank has predicted a negative drop by 11% of Russian GDP for this year. And people are beginning to feel that. And what's interesting is they're beginning to blame the West rather than Russia. And we were hoping that they would blame Russia. But because of the fact that people can't use their credit cards, they get to the stores and they say, well, sorry, why is the West doing this to us? And they said, I don't know, but the West is attacking us. And it goes back to this age-old sense of Western threats. And Putin is a master at manipulating linguistically this kind of historical language. And so he's framed it all as Russia is the victim of Western conspiracy, of Western attempts to do Russia in. And they really, Putin really does believe this. He's very threat oriented, and it's not instrumental. I think we do need to take it very seriously. In the long term, so therefore, the short term, it seems to have bolstered the regime. In the medium term, I'm not so clear. He's already, we do know he's very worried about cracks in his own regime. He's fired about 150 of his own intelligence officers. Shoigu has done a terrible job for him. He pushed Shoigu, defense minister, out of the way. There was nobody running this military command from the top. It was just being done by 4 different command centers around. Now it's being commanded by the Southern Command, by General Dvornikov. So he's pushed Shoigu out of the way. Whether Shoigu is going to continue to support Putin after the military is being humiliated, and after the military wasn't even properly prepared, and that's partly out of corruption, but it's partly because Putin, they didn't put plans in place, and so they blame each other. That could put cracks on the regime. The intelligence security services, we're beginning to see cracks there. So whether the regime will hold is anybody's guess. My hunch is that it's not going to go anywhere for any time soon. There are just too many vested interests in this. It's too anchored. But over the long term, as the economy begins to weaken, and it clearly will, and as China resists wanting to help Russia as much as it wants, which I also think that's going to happen. It's not going to come in to the degree that Russia wants to help it. I'm not so sure that Russia is going to, that the regime is going to come out of this okay. Putin is not going to be there forever. The real concern, and again, this is more medium to long term. I think the short term, he's there, but medium to long term, I'm not so sure. The worrying thing is what will replace him. Because it's the liberals are either in the West or also arrested or dead. And also, quite frankly, the West is not the same kind of beacon that it once was, because of our own hypocrisy, because our own unwillingness to own up to the grievances that most of the even liberals feel. It's like, hey, you really have treated us unfairly over the last 30 years for a variety of reasons, some of which I got into. So therefore, there's not a huge pro-Western liberal camp. There's more just a anti-Putin camp. So that's my big concern.
Thank you for that. The next question is coming from the chat. Paul is wondering, his question is, every widget we use in the US is made in China. With new technologies such as 3D printing, we could move a lot of manufacturing back to the United States and other allied countries. How powerful would China be then without us sustaining their economy and us being the United States?
I think, Paul, I mean, I'm not a China specialist, and you probably know a lot more about that part of it, judging from your question, than I do. Nevertheless, I do know something about this, and I do know that China. I know a lot about Chinese foreign policy thinking, and I do know that they are extremely worried about losing that benefit that they've so utterly benefited from globalization, and they're worried about being cut out of this to the extent that their own GDP will suffer so greatly, and therefore their own social contract will begin to collapse. And so I think that explains a lot of the Chinese waffling on this case. They're really stuck on Ukraine and didn't expect it to blow up in their faces in quite the same way. So because I think they would ask the same question, how powerful would we be if we're, if we don't have the exports to both the EU and to the United States that we have. As I'm sure you know too, the EU is an even bigger recipient of Chinese exports than the United States. I think for the United States, it's about 630 billion. For the EU, it's 690 billion. So it's even bigger for the EU. So to lose all of that over this, I don't think is worth it to them. So they're going to try and play the middleman. But I'm not so sure with Xi if he's making the best decisions on this. It'll be very interesting to see what they do.
And the next question, if anyone would like to present on screen, please just raise your hand, but we'll continue on with the chat questions. This next one is from Curtis Cook. He is interested in kind of that quote and getting more information about that quote that you included at the end of your presentation about unjust peace for an unjust war. And he asks, what would this unjust peace look like?
Yeah, very interesting question. A lot of people are talking about what that might look like, and this is just Curtis, it's just very, I think, speculative at this point. But one of the things is, all right, let's let Russia go ahead and have Crimea. It's theirs basically, it's theirs anyway. It's such an anomaly anyway, historically and everything else. Okay, let's have them have Crimea. Let's go ahead and make Ukraine neutral. Zelensky, as I'm sure you know, was even putting forward the idea of some kind of either neutrality with security guarantees of some sort anyway, or just some form of neutrality. And then perhaps letting maybe some part of Donbass, whether it be the statelets or some kind of compromise there. Maybe it would be a referendum in the Donbass that would be internationally observed. But the problem is I don't see now that the Ukrainians will they might do some form of neutrality, because NATO enlargement for them, NATO membership. I mean, now the majority of the country supports it, but it's a fairly recent thing. It's because of Russia's own actions that the Ukrainians want NATO membership. They didn't want it until 2015. Up until then, they were pretty much against the idea of NATO. They wanted to be neutral. In fact, it was even in their own legislation that they would become neutral. And it was the leadership of Ukraine that pushed NATO membership, which is quite an interesting event that not many people really remember. But therefore, neutrality might be something, especially if there's security guarantees. Maybe, what that would look like. It could just be US security guarantees. This is the guy who says this. It would be US security guarantees, but not NATO. That might, at least Putin can then go home and say, well, NATO, there's no more NATO enlargement. But then, of course, the US security guarantees. But that still gets us into a trouble, because it makes us have to support, it has to come to Ukraine's aid in case there's another war. But there's also been talk about maybe bringing the Chinese in to try to support those security guarantees too. But, it's mostly just a lot of compromises on the part of the Ukrainians. And that's part of the reason why this is so hard, because it's really hard to see how the Ukrainians can make any compromises that would be acceptable to the Ukrainian people at this point. So it's really, Curtis, an academic debate at this point.
Oh my goodness. As Julie so rightly said, this sobering discussion might drive us all to our wet bars. But for me, I'm contemplating the fact that the more things change, the more they stay the same, and how important it all is for us to continue in our efforts through World Affairs Councils, through the wonderful pursuits that Julie leads and others, her colleagues, in trying to find that bridge to solve and create greater respect for all the influences that impact us all and continue to do so. Well, you win the award for the most comprehensive and riveting presentation we've heard yet on this topic. I'm sad that we are on this topic, but I'm grateful that you are involved in leading to its solution. So please accept all of our thanks for your time and wisdom this evening. And good night, everybody. We'll be concluding our presentation at this time, but wish Dr. Newton all the best and our sincere gratitude for this wonderful event.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you for bearing with me for such a long talk. I appreciate it.